Hello, and welcome to everyone to today's Learning Lab, where we will hear the first of our scheduled appraiser views. My name is Peter Negline. I am based in Singapore with BOC Aviation, and I'm also an ISTAT director. And later you will be seeing one of my colleagues, Mahmood Kuzbari, who's also another ISTAT director and who's based in London and the CEO of Novus Aviation Capital. Now, ISTAT's proud of its Certified Appraiser program, and you can read and learn more details about that program at the ISTAT website. And today we're delighted to have two ISTAT Certified Senior Appraisers presenting their views on the current critical market issues with some perspective on 2022. The two appraisers that are joining us today are Olga Razzhivina, who is a director of Oriel. She co-founded the organisation along with Les Wheel a few years ago. Olga has in excess of 20 years industry experience. She started with Avmark as an aviation analyst and then moved on to become the editor of the Aviation Economist. She joined Air Claims and Ascend, where she continued to work around aircraft and engine appraisals with an emphasis on large portfolios and regional markets. At Oriel, she carries on her appraisal work and is an expert as well as some expert witness for clients. Olga was kind enough some months ago to do a podcast for us, and I would encourage you to find that on the ISTAT website and listen to more of her career in that recording. The other appraiser joining us today is Stuart Rubin, who's a Vice President and Managing Director of Aviation at ICF International in the Washington area. Stuart leads their aviation practice. He also has in excess of 20 years of aviation experience, specialising in asset valuations, aircraft market research, asset management, and lease analysis. Stuart has extensive experience valuing tangible assets, and he's worked very closely over the years with clients, providing asset valuations and due diligence and transaction support. He also offers services related to market and financial analysis, aircraft program management, aircraft remarketing, and sourcing. Now, the format of today's lab is that Olga and Stuart will jointly present their views over a period of sort of 40 to 45 minutes, and then we will open, or Mahmood in particular will open to audience Q&A at that point. So we would encourage the audience to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen as we go along to add your questions. Now, before we begin, I just want to highlight two upcoming learning labs that we have scheduled. Next week on December the 7th, we will have Airbus presenting their views on the air cargo markets. And on December the 9th, we will have Adam Pulaski, who's going to spend an hour exclusively taking audience Q&A. So finally, I've mentioned about the Q&A and hopefully you'll submit your questions there. So with that, I would like to hand it over to both Olga and to Stuart to take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for that great introduction, and thank you to ISTAT for affording myself and Olga the opportunity to share our views with you. We've prepared I think a relatively brief slide deck to talk about some trends that we're seeing in terms of both fleets as well as values, and then we've got a variety of topics that I think we want to delve into that we think might be key interest to the audience. So Olga, I'll pass it over to you. Oops, I'll pass it over to you for the agenda.
Thank you, Stuart, and good morning and good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and thank you for tuning into this lab. And as Stuart said, we've got a presentation which covers the issues of how the market has behaved in the last 12 months and how the traffic and aircraft values have been behaving. We'll also look into the future and talk about the recovery trends for 2022. We'll talk about narrow bodies and wide bodies. And then we will move into a discussion where we will cover several topics, including how, as appraisers, we should be looking at the base values in the light of the recent events, and how we see the impairments and changes in the base value. We will touch on some other aircraft sectors like the regional market dynamics, where obviously regional aircraft have been quite key in the market while the traffic was depressed. I will talk about freighters, which have been very hot on the agenda for the last 12 months and seen by a lot of people by an exit strategy from the passenger aircraft. And that will move us on to exit strategies other than freight conversion, also looking at a bit of a engine market, parts market. And then we would like to touch on the longer term trends and the implications of the ESG on the air travel market, and most importantly on the aircraft values and how we see that from two sides of the Atlantic. And then we obviously will pass the reins to Peter and open floor for the Q&A. So with that, I'll pass the reins back to Stuart to talk about what happened in the last 12 months.
Great, thanks, Olga. And I think you make a great point. You know, we're trying to look at this. We've been asked to look at this from two sides of the Atlantic, but we do recognize that this is a global industry. But I think we've both identified, you know, certain trends and issues that are facing those two distinct regions. So we thought it would be good to just sort of talk a little bit about where we've been, and kind of I put together a few slides just to, you know, talk about not only kind of what happened and how this crisis has looked in relation to other historic crises, but also, you know, kind of how we see the forecast, you know, traffic recovery forecast to pre-COVID levels. You know, we can see from 2020, the 2020 numbers, you know, just a massive drop off in RPKs and change in GDP growth. Obviously, it was, you know, it was a crisis that we'd never on the likes we'd never seen before, completely dwarfing the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. In terms of, you know, where we see things going forward, you know, the industry has been resilient. I think that we've seen a fair bit of recovery, you know, so far, seeing some, you know, some much vastly improved traffic numbers and frankly much better utilization on aircraft over the past certainly 6 to 8 months. In terms of traffic recovery to pre-COVID levels, you know, North America and Asia Pacific, we expect to lead those, you know, the recovery, with Europe and Africa and the Latin American region, you know, kind of lagging behind. One thing to unpack in here in these numbers is that there is a difference between domestic and international market recovery. We think the domestic markets, domestic traffic is going to recover, you know, more rapidly than international markets. And we've seen that here in the US, where we've had a reasonably robust recovery in terms of traffic, and we'll look at that a little bit further in the piece. But I think it's important to note that you know, there's distinctions between domestic and international recovery rates. This one just sort of you know, I think gives you the magnitude of the impact on capacity and how it changed as a result of the COVID downturn. Obviously, older generation aircraft were hit a lot harder than newer generation types, and this is something that we've seen before. For those of you that have been around in the industry as long as Olga and I have, you remember the crisis after 9/11, which really culled the older generation aircraft, 727s, 737-200s, DC-9s, you know, the older aircraft, much harder than it did kind of younger, newer generation aircraft. We've seen the same thing here. Older wide bodies really got hammered in this downturn. But you know, given the impact on traffic and the fact that you know, international markets were adversely impacted, we also saw newer wide bodies, their capacity come off dramatically, and those numbers are still, I think, pretty depressed in terms of what's been parked and what's flying. This chart just sort of illustrates the, you know, kind of where the inactive fleet was prior to the really the onset of the crisis in, you know, late 19, 20, early 20. The April 2020 numbers is really kind of the low point, and the point at which I think we saw the worst in terms of aircraft parked. And you can see, as of October 2021, there's been a pretty good level of recovery. We're certainly still not back to, the pre-COVID levels, but you can see that, certain regions have, been able to recover, certainly to a reasonable extent, including Europe, which, is showing about 10% of their fleet inactive as of the end of October 2021. So I talked earlier about, the fact that North America had been performing better than kind of the rest of the world, and this is sourced from IATA, and it's actually fairly recent. It's updated as of September 2021. And clearly, you can see that North American markets have, generally outperformed the rest of the world, and certainly vastly outperformed, European markets. I think part of that is the fact that we've had a fairly aggressive, uptake in vaccines and boosters, notwithstanding some of the political jargon and language that we hear, these days in terms of vaccine hesitancy. But really, I think that, it does illustrate kind of some of the resiliency of the market and how quickly the North American market has been recovering. To some extent, the freight market is similar, but it is, we've seen cargo traffic be really heavy. We've had a massive boost in e-commerce. Certainly, with the move for people to work from home, moving out of offices, just everyone's using e-commerce services, and that's going to continue to grow. We would expect these growth numbers to just continue to climb, particularly on the back of the growth in e-commerce, which is expected to account for about 6.5 trillion in revenues by 2023. We do expect to see global trade to rebound by next year on the back of this significant demand, and this correspondingly has an impact on demand for freighters, not only dedicated main deck freighters, but also converted freighters, dedicated main deck factory freighters, as well as converted freighters. A little bit more about kind of the segmentation down to narrow body, wide body, and into the regional jet space. I think what's apparent here is that we saw. We've seen a very good recovery in terms of aircraft returning to service, on the narrow body side, to some extent on the wide body side, and then also to some extent on the regional jet side. But I think that we still see a fair amount of room to go, particularly on the wide body front and on the RJ side. One other element that we like to look at as appraisers is what is available in the market as a proxy for demand. And we took a look at some historic numbers in terms of availability. And as expected, the availability increased, kind of from the onset of the COVID-19 crisis. But, and we've seen elevated rates. However, what's interesting is that the percentage of the fleet available is currently lower than when we saw in the onset of the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. Part of this is, I think that there was limited demand for, what we were seeing, at least in the space, was there was a lot of disconnect, if you will, between buyers and sellers. Sellers were expecting higher prices than what buyers were willing to sell. So I think a lot of aircraft weren't placed on the market, but certainly I think some owners also weren't willing to take the write down. So we haven't seen the level of availability, that we saw in 2008, 2009. And whether that's a testament to, more discipline or just more savvy financial management, I think is apparent. As I talked earlier in the piece, the the onset of crises in this industry does impact older generation aircraft more heavily than younger generation aircraft. Obviously there is higher demand for the aircraft that are newer. They're more efficient. They're going to be more in this case ESG friendly. So we certainly have seen a similar trend. We saw if you think about the classic aircraft, which would be in the 08-09 financial crisis, would be early A320s, early NGs, 737 classics. We saw a lot of those aircraft becoming available. However, the recent generation aircraft, which are more recent delivered 737 NGs and A320 CEOs, the availability on those aircraft has risen, but again, it's not nearly to the level that we saw in the 2008, 2009 financial crisis. So again, I think it's to some extent some discipline on aircraft owners and not willing to sell at what might be distressed prices. And the other element I think to note is that we just see very few availability on MAX and NEO aircraft, at least publicly available. Obviously, I think that there have been some aircraft that have been moved out, particularly some of the MAX aircraft that were grounded that may have, as a result of the MCAS challenges and the software changes, some of those aircraft have been moved out. But certainly in terms of public availability, we've seen very low levels there, which is not surprising. The wide body story is certainly more challenging, and we certainly knew that there were challenges in the wide body space prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly for the older, I'll call them older generation, but they're really sort of older current generation, shall we say, 330s, A340s, 777s, older 777s like 200 ERs. Those aircraft have certainly spiked during the recent pandemic. And again, I think that that's something that we saw prior to COVID-19, where we saw fairly high levels of A330 availability, as well as 777, challenges in the 777-200 ER market, likely going back to 2015. What I think is concerning is whether the market is going to be able to absorb these aircraft that are available. Obviously, some organizations have taken the step of putting aircraft into freight conversion, perhaps maybe a little bit earlier than they had expected to, but seeking ways to address the supply concerns and the supply issues that they may be having with wide body aircraft. Certainly something that we're seeing lessors do. As you can see, the classic aircraft, which are your older 747s, certainly seeing very little availability there, just because I don't think there's much demand on that front. I think now I'm going to kick it over to Olga. And I guess yeah, I'll kick it over to Olga to talk about value trends, kind of what they're seeing. But before I do, Olga, anything to add on the part and availability?
Well, I think not necessarily on availability, but on the earlier part about shape of recovery. And I know in the first slide you had years to 2019 levels, to recovery to 2019 levels. I think one of the things we have to be very cognizant after every downturn, that the industry that comes out of the downturn is different from that that's gone in. So the pre-downturn measures might not necessarily be the all-in measure of recovery. So we probably will see an industry that is in traffic composition somewhat different to earlier. We probably will see a decrease in business traffic, and that will have an effect on how the aircraft look and what aircraft are more called on by the airlines. And I think that's one of the things we have to remember. We have to not only look at how it compares to pre-crisis, but also be expecting to see new trends and new developments every time that the industry recovers from a major event. And obviously the crisis we're hopefully just coming out of is the the most disruptive event to the industry. So we would be only expecting to see biggest changes post that event in the industry, and reaching out to all sectors. But that's my view on the recovery. And yes, as Stuart said, I'll be talking briefly about the value trends. If you could move me on to the next slide. So this is a little bit of a chart I need to explain. So this chart shows market to base value ratio. And for those of our viewers who are not very familiar with the ISTAT valuation terminology, the market value is the current price of the aircraft. You can think of it as a spot price. Base value is a more of a long-term value view, which excludes the influences of today's market, whether it's positive or negative. So it looks at the value decline of aircraft in relation mostly to its age over time. It doesn't happen in a straight line, but the importance of the market to base value ratio is that when the market value is above the base value, so your spot price is a bit above your long-term trend, indicates a strong market, and the opposite, when the market value is below base, indicates a weak market for the aircraft. And in this chart, Oriel, we started tracking the ratio between market and base values at Oriel since pretty much we started trading in early 2014. And this is based on the world fleet of existing aircraft, excluding retired aircraft, for all aircraft that we provide market and base values for. It's not weighted for value. And one word of caution is that it's not includes the same gamut of aircraft throughout, because some aircraft that we provided base values for when we started in 2014 included, for example, 737 classic passenger aircraft, 747 passenger aircraft, which have now we have removed from the base value portfolio because these aircraft are unlikely to have a long-term future. So, but anyways, what you see is the colors, and the blue and greens indicate the aircraft which have market value above base. And on the right, you'll see the gradation of colors by amount of difference. And oranges and reds and yellows indicate where the market value is below base. And when we started tracking the market in 2014, we saw quite a lot of aircraft, either blue, green, or gray. Gray indicates where the values are around the equilibrium, so around between -to +4%. We have seen the deterioration of naked aircraft values. I must say these are values excluding the lease, attached leases, so they're just the metal. And later obviously in 2020, we have seen a significant deterioration of the market compared to base value. We still have a small margin of aircraft where the market value is stronger than the base, and that would include very hot freighter aircraft and some other types, but the majority of aircraft are seeing market below base. And one of the important things to note is that unlike the pre-Lehman's, we did not go into this crisis from a very strong strength point. Before 2020, we had some 50% of aircraft showing that their market value below base, and I'll get into it in a short time. So looking at the individual sectors, Stu, could I move to the next slide, please? So this is the same chart for narrow-body aircraft, and you will see very similar dynamic because obviously narrow-body aircraft constitute the majority of the world fleet. But again, we see a very strong drop in number of aircraft that where the market is above base, and we're seeing a lot of weakness. There is a tiny glimmer of hope towards the right hand of the chart, which is the most recent value developments that we've seen. We are seeing some of the narrow body values, especially the new generation, start having bottomed out and starting to go up, and we have been reflecting it in our values, and I'll get into it into individual aircraft types. So we are starting to see the signs of recovery, which is very encouraging. And on the next slide, we're looking at wide bodies, where unfortunately the signs of recovery are yet to be found. And you will see that it has, the wide body sector in particular was very depressed already as it is, with about 70% of aircraft with a market value below base, even before we entered the crisis. And I'll speak to the reasons of that when I touch on the specific aircraft types. So, Stu, did you want to say anything about the recovery, or would you be happy for me to carry on with the individual aircraft types?
Yeah, I'll just say, I mean, I would generally agree with what you presented in terms of the base value to market value ratio. I just would, you touched on the definition of base value and market value. One thing to think about, and one thing that as appraisers we certainly think about, is the market value, the base value and market value should equal each other when the market is in equilibrium. So it can be stated that if you have aircraft that have market values below base, the assumption is that at some point those aircraft will get back to a higher, the market value should improve as the market improves. One thing that I think is, that we're seeing, and something we discuss, I think, Olga, you probably discuss it as well internally with your team, is that there are some aircraft that we may not ever get back to that base value level. And so it could be, the adjustment of base values, and I think we'll get to it in the next section. The adjustment of base values, might be is something that's done when, perhaps appraisers believe that an aircraft is not going to, is ever going to recover. But again, that's a discussion that I think appraisers have. Certainly we have it on our team. I'm sure you do too, but I just want to make that one comment there.
Great, thank you, Stu. Yes, so looking at the individual aircraft types, I've picked a few of the more popular narrow bodies and wide bodies. So here we have A320ceo on the left and the 737NG 800 on the right. And these are the constant age charts. So we're looking at 5-year increments. So new on the top in blue, then 5-year-old in green, 10-year-old in red, and 15-year-old in dark burgundy. The solid lines are the values, market values, and the dashed lines are the lease rates. So we can see that both aircraft types values have had quite a peak in pre-Lehman time, and then they've suffered quite a value and lease rate loss over the next years between 2009 2010. What we didn't see is a strong recovery, and possibly a little bit more of recovery on the 737NG side for the reasons of problems with the MAX, which was supposed to replace it. But other than that, we haven't seen a huge amount of pickup after we saw the Lehmans. And now we have had the 2020 crisis, and the values and lease rates have gone into it from the lower base than would have been expected. Now, will we see a recovery in that sector? I would say definitely for the younger vintages, and we have already seen stronger values for the younger 737NGs, especially if they're in a mini fleet rather than single aircraft being remarketed. The dynamics of the A320ceo is a little bit less strong, but we definitely will see an uptick for the younger vintages. There is a difference in preference between the CFM and V2500 powered aircraft, and that at the moment it seems that the CFM powered aircraft are a little bit easier to place, but that's not to say that the V-powered aircraft won't come back either. So we would, as I said, we would expect recovery for the younger vintages, whereas for the older vintages, there is the freight conversion programs that provide a certain floor for the values. But even those, we have seen values deteriorate quite significantly over the crisis. But again, we probably will see a stronger support on the older vintage aircraft for the NGs, because the freighter conversion programs are just so much that much further ahead in their development and the numbers of aircraft they can take than the A320 side, which is mostly concentrating on the larger 321. Moving on to the next slide. Obviously, for the A320neo and 737 MAX 8, we can't put such a populated charts as we saw for the older aircraft types. There's obviously much less data, but we have seen the new generation aircraft mostly performing on the back of sale leasebacks, but also on the, obviously those transactions have to be dissected more by appraisers because they do involve a lease stream, but also placement of some unencumbered aircraft, because inevitably through the crisis we have seen some airlines moving away from their orders, especially when it came to MAX aircraft that has been grounded for quite a long period of time. And some of the airlines took the opportunity to get out of their contractual clauses and cut down on their capital expenditure. But looking into the future, we're already seeing the values moving somewhat upwards. That's a natural trend, and we will see them going up with the recovery. We would expect lease rates to hopefully follow, but one of the features of this downturn was the remarkable performance of the sale-leaseback market, where some transactions did not bear any hallmarks of the deals done during a crisis. You almost could say crisis, what crisis, given the prices paid for the aircraft and sale-leasebacks, and also the still relatively low level of lease rates that's been achieved in those transactions. So that was quite interesting to observe. And that's another testament to the fact that the capital is not drying out for the aircraft sector, and airlines still have some amount of the pricing power, especially if they can present a good credit. Moving to a much less exuberant side of the market, the wide bodies. Here I have some of the out of production and nearly out of production aircraft. So the Airbus A330-300, which has been replaced by the Neo 900 and the 777-300ER, which, although is not, its replacement is moving out into the future, is its order books are dwindling. So we have seen the values of these aircraft on a downward trajectory pretty much since the 2014-2015 timeframe, and this has not been predicated by the crisis, which has not arrived until 2020. In our view, the downward movement of the values was really caused by the increased production in the wide-body sector, and the fact that these effectively overproduction, when you take all of the types from two manufacturers across the Atlantic into account, have all but killed off the secondary market for a lot of the aircraft. Even though the secondary market still exists, it's much smaller than anybody would have expected it to be in the last 10 years ago, for example. So what we see here is not necessarily the effect of the crisis, which were obviously very profound, and we have seen further drop in values and lease rates for both of these aircraft types. But we're also seeing a much more systemic influence on the values of these aircraft, and potentially on the useful lives of these aircraft types, because they aren't finding a strong secondary market, and more aircraft will have to be moved out of passenger service, whether by being converted into freighters or by being retired. So this is where we see the systemic issues with the sector and with particular aircraft types, and that will feed into our discussion of the base value changes shortly after. And moving on to the new generation aircraft, again, much less populated charts for the A350-900 and 797-9. Their values have, especially for the older vintages, have had the downward slope as well in the last 5 years. And that is the extension of the issues that we've been having in the wide body sector altogether, because relatively comparable, relatively young, older generation aircraft were being available at incredibly low lease rates and consequentially values. Would we expect the values and lease rates of these new generation types to recover? Definitely yes. We would expect this aircraft to be the backbone of the world fleets for quite a while, and we will expect their values to perform quite strongly for a wide body type, which doesn't mean that they will be performing strongly compared to strong narrow bodies like, for example, the 737 and 800. So this is our when this recovery will happen. We would expect once the recovery in Asia has started in the earnest, because that's where most of the wide body aircraft are either placed or flying to. So once we see that happening, hopefully in the summer of next year, we will start seeing recovery in wide body values as well, starting from the new generation aircraft types, but maybe not for some of the older out of production aircraft types. Stu, I think I can hand over to you here.
Yeah, thanks, Olga. And just to add, a couple of notes, certainly around the issue of the question around the V2500 versus the CFM powered A320s. There's a fairly expensive AD out for the V2500 engine that's driving a lot of those engines into early shop visits. So I think that's been clouding that, challenging that market somewhat. In terms of wide body recovery and wide body values, certainly don't have anything to disagree on there. Certainly, as I think I said before, we've been seeing softness in the wide body space well before the late 2019, going back several years, particularly around types like the A330. So no surprise there. But what is interesting is that should the recovery get into a should the international recovery begin to move in earnest, one of the OEMs have cut back on production rates quite heavily, and I do think that while we do expect to see recovery for wide bodies, newer ones especially, I do think that there's the chance that given the lower production rates, if we do see traffic come back a little bit more robustly on the international front, we might see some recovery in wide body values particularly for older aircraft as a result. Again, because the OEMs have cut back on production rates, and I don't know, the ramp up rate for wide bodies isn't as rapid as on the narrow bodies. So that's just the few things I'll add there. I think in terms of next topics, we picked a variety of discussion points that we thought would be valuable as Olga went over in the agenda. One of the things, the first point that we wanted to talk about was base value and base value impairments. How do we see them? What's driving changes? And kind of give our respective views in terms of where we're seeing base values. I think the biggest thing to remember, and the base value is, it's the value of the aircraft in a purely neutral market. where supply and demand are in reasonable balance. But it's also, if you look at the ISTAT definition, it's founded in the historical trend in values. So, base values generally, don't, they gradually decline over time. It does take, significant changes generally aren't made unless there is a significant reason where you see a lot of data that indicates that the base values have to come down. So, from our perspective, we have made some adjustments to base values internally. We review our numbers and our values fairly regularly to make sure they reflect our long-term views. But in terms of in response to this crisis, we haven't made, I would say, wholesale changes to base values. We have adjusted wide bodies, and I think appraisers have a lot of different tools in terms of levers to make changes to their base value curves. We can change depreciation rates. We can change the economic useful life assumptions around the aircraft. I think for certain types, particularly A330s and some older, wide bodies and narrow bodies, we've adjusted economic useful lives down, by a couple of years, and that has a corresponding, adjustment down in terms of the base value. But we haven't made significant changes or impairments to our numbers as of yet. In terms of 2022 outlook, it's something we're looking at closely and something we're gonna follow closely. I would expect us to make some more downward adjustments on older aircraft. And when I say older aircraft, I think narrow bodies older than 15 years of age and wide bodies that are above 12 years of age certainly going to be something that we're going to be looking at closely. But in terms of wholesale impairments where we're crushing values at a fairly high level, that's not something that we have done, and I'm not sure we're going to foresee doing that in the near future. Olga, your view?
Yes, thank you, Stu. Our view at Oriel is a bit different, even though, although we agree on the definitions of market value and base value and how they generally would be expected to behave with respect to each other. While we do review our market values very frequently, and we look at the market and we try to reflect any changes in the market as soon as they happen, our view towards base value is that of a long-term view, which should not come with frequent changes, because inevitably the market bias would creep in and the base value wouldn't be any different from the market. So we have set out our base values for all aircraft that we cover when we started trading in 2014. We try to learn from the lessons of our previous valuation life, i.e. that oftentimes base values were, market values have never reached the base values few years down. So we try to take a more realistic view on the base values. And we only have reviewed our base values for the wide-body aircraft in the beginning of the 2019. So when we were still at the quite high point in the traffic growth and not a cloud on the horizon. And even then it became evident to us that the older wide bodies, so at the time nearly out of production A330s and 777s, market values were depressed to the point where there could not be expected any recovery to or above base values. And as Stuart rightly said, market value should be below and above base value in equal measures, and only when the market is in equilibrium should they be equal to each other. So in our view, the systemic overproduction of the wide bodies in the 10 years preceding 2019 has led to the situation where a secondary market has become very compressed for the wide-body aircraft, and therefore the market values were not likely to come back to base value levels. So we have adjusted our base values for those aircraft types that I mentioned in the beginning of 2019. And then as we were seeing the market develop, we gave them a little tweak in the 2020. And that tweak included not just reducing the useful life, as we said, from 30 to 25 years, but also increasing the rates of the value depreciation and moving the starting point of the base value down. So we're hoping that the base values that we have produced in the beginning of 2020 for the nearly out of production aircraft do reflect a more realistic long-term view, and in which the market values will have a chance to equal and exceed the base value. We are conducting the review of the base values for the narrow-body aircraft at the end of this year to reflect them in 2022. We're not expecting changes for the new generation aircraft and the younger popular narrow bodies, although there might be some slight changes in the base value curve shapes for the older vintages, about 10 years and above of those aircraft. We also have reviewed the regional aircraft in 2020 because those a lot of the types, for example, the Embraer E1 generation, have displayed the similar value loss characteristics to the wide-body aircraft, with the first 10 years of the or 12 years of the types seeing much more value reduction than would otherwise be expected based on historical observations. So we have adjusted those base values as well. So once we have done our review, we will be waiting another 5 to 6 years until we do the next review, because that will show us at least half or a bit more than a half of a regular aircraft value cycle. And in this way, we won't be following the changes we see annually in the market, whether it's inflation rates or interest rates or any other inputs that some appraisers may use for those values. So that's our view on the base value impairments and reviews. And as such, we haven't dropped any base values because of the downturn, because that's a cyclic, that's an episodic event that should be reflected in the market values. But the events preceding the crisis and exacerbated by it have led to some review of the out of production and nearly out of production wide-body values and regional jets.
Okay, well, first of all, I managed to change my positioning of my light, so I'm now no longer looking like I'm in a witness protection program. Sorry about that. No, but I think moving on to kind of the next point of discussion is on regional aircraft. You know, kind of what we're seeing in terms of that space, given changes in the OEMs. I think that and concerns about scope clause, particularly given that's a North American carrier, really North American carrier phenomenon, and then the question of re-engineering on the E2, whether or not what impact that has had, on the why hasn't it had the same impact in terms of demand dynamics as we saw when the 737NG and the A320 CO re-engine. And I'm happy to kick this one off. I think one of the things that we've seen, now that we have basically a two-horse race in the regional space with Embraer, producing the E-Jet platform and ATR building turboprops. Even though NHI has taken on the CRJ program, I think the numbers are quite low, and so probably be limited opportunities for MHI to place a lot of aircraft going forward. That being said, CRJs, across the C class, 50 to 90 to 100 seats account for about 1/3 of all RJs globally. So, Even though new production is likely to be very limited going forward in the foreseeable future, there is a fairly sizable fleet of those aircraft in the space, and they will continue to operate, you know, as the industry moves forward. I think it's worth mentioning the A220 because, again, that was originally developed as a Bombardier product, but it, you know, it a bit, in my view, straddles the regional and narrow body sectors. You know, the aircraft comes in two flavors: a smaller 100 packs for 110 packs variant, and then a larger 130 packs variant. And clearly, I think Airbus is marketing it towards you know, both regional as well as mainline operators. And that aircraft has certainly been quite successful. Backlog totals about 464 units. So I don't see any significant changes in, you know, kind of that dynamic in terms of that, you know, that sort of duopoly, if you will, between Embraer and ATR within the regional sector. Talking about the, you know, scope clause relaxation, you know, I think it's been quite acute on demand for the E175, particularly the E175 E2. About 80+% of the E175 fleet is operated in North America with U.S. carriers. And scope clause, you know, because of scope clause constraints, the 175 E2 it does not currently meet the requirements with respect to takeoff weight. So, you know, we've obviously seen U.S. regional carriers come in for more 175 E1s, and Embraer's continue to build them. But I think it clearly is going to present a challenge for the E2 going forward, the 175 E2 going forward, to, you know, until there's scope clause relaxation. And again, it's not clear kind of when we'll see scope clause relaxation, if we will. I think, you know, the recent United deal adjusted the numbers somewhat, but certainly I don't see, you know, in the future you know, the use of the changes in scope clause to allow the heavier jets to be, you know, operated in North America. And just as just reminded, scope clause, you know, for those of you that are not aware, don't know what it is. Scope clause is basically a clause in pilot contracts that limits the number of regional aircraft that may operate for a mainline carrier. And a lot of times the ratios of those ratios are made up based on the amount of aircraft operated at the mainline versus the regional operator. That being said, I think that a lot of the mainline carriers are looking to push some of their flying down to the regional carriers. So there's obviously that back and forth between the mainline operator and the regional carriers to try and, you know, utilize those smaller aircraft a bit more efficiently and a bit more. The final point that, you know, we're seeing in terms of the market for the E2, you know, again, we're still, I think that if you look at the backlog in the E2 right now, it's really focused on the 195. There's not a huge amount of demand for the 190 E2, and certainly, as I said before, not a lot of demand for the 175 E2. In fact, they're still selling the 175 E1 into North America, and there's still about 150 aircraft on firm order backlog. You know, I think that there's probably some challenges there. There's still the E-Jet program is still relatively young. The first aircraft was delivered in 2004. It was a 170, and so you know, there's also not a huge amount of commonality between the E1 and the E2. There's only about 30% parts commonality on the airframe. So, you know, in terms of getting maintenance synergies and efficiencies by adopting the new technology platform, it's not quite there. Just by a comparison, the 320ceo to neo parts commonality on the airframe is somewhere on the order of above 85%. So certainly, you know, not having those synergies in terms of parts commonality does sort of mitigate some of the benefit of buying the new technology aircraft. in terms of kind of outlook for 2022, we're certainly seeing, again, as I said, more, movement of regional traffic from the mainline carriers to the smaller aircraft. The other thing that we are looking at closely as recovery happens, pilot shortages is something that I think is that we're seeing, and that's a real thing. And if there is if the mainline carriers start pulling pilots up from the regionals, certainly would be something to consider. It might have an impact on regionals' ability to grow going forward. Olga, your thoughts on the regional space?
Yes, thank you, Stu. Obviously, the regional space in Europe and outside US is much not as strong. It's not as large number of aircraft. It's always been a very much a North American phenomenon. It's interesting, the dynamic of regional aviation against the ESG, because a lot of European airlines have their government bailouts over the crisis time have been linked to the removing flights from very short distances. Sometimes this is a very draconian approach without considering the actual geography of the landscape, but there are some incentives to remove flights where a train service can replace them, and the train journey doesn't exceed 2.5 hours. So some of those routes are going to be affecting the regional space. On the other hand, the first green bond was done by financing has been done by Deutsche Bank, and that included the ATR aircraft as one of the least polluting aircraft by virtue of being a turboprop. So it's an interesting dual approach to the two from two sides of the ESG. But to your previous point, the E2 generation of the Embraer E-jets have been a little commonality with the E1, and also unfortunately being much heavier, which excluded it from the scope clause in the United States, where it's got the biggest market. Probably that replacement has been too soon, and without considering the key market and hoping that that key market is going to be changing, which it failed to do so. So that will be an interesting dynamic to watch, and also the effective exit of the CRJ from the regional market marks the creates a situation which is not very favorable for airlines, because they are not having a competition of providers, because in a lot of cases ATR cannot compete, a turboprop cannot compete with a regional jet, and that does not create a real competition scenario. And for some of the airlines, it's quite an important point because of the corporate governance and the competition procedures that they have to follow, where they have to have competing parties to their RFPs, which is going to be quite difficult when you have one regional jet manufacturer and one turboprop manufacturer. So we'll see how that space develops and how airlines are dealing with it.
Thanks, Olga. I think that's a good point. I think we're well into an hour into the conversation. We obviously have a couple of other elements. I'm just to talk through, but obviously cognizant of time. Olga, perhaps of the remaining topics we have, maybe can you pick one and start, one of the ones that we had discussed. Maybe we can just do a very quick commentary on it.
Okay, I'll very quickly comment on the ESG, as I already started talking about it in relation to the regional space. It is a much stronger topic on our side of the Atlantic than it seems to be in the US. we're already seeing some of the financial institutions like European banks looking at the environmental impact of the aircraft that they finance, and starting to move towards the newer generation, as obviously that's the only way to improve the green credentials of the aircraft. So that obviously puts a pressure on being able to finance the older generation of aircraft and the older vintages. And that can have, if that influence spreads outside Europe and into major financial institutions dealing with our industry and beyond, that could have quite a significant negative implications for the useful lives of the older generation aircraft, and might push them out of the markets, or at least financeable markets, sooner than otherwise would have been expected. There might not be an a convenient route of ABS, or put an aircraft into some kind of a securitization, maybe because the securitization buyers are ESG conscious and don't want a very old aircraft. So those influences, I think, are going to be with us well past the COVID crisis, because they're totally unrelated, and I think they will affect our industry in the medium and long term, and they're something to be watched very carefully.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one where there really are some real differences between what's happening in Europe versus the U.S. And I do think, as an industry, there's always a need or a push to get more efficient, and a push to be to pay less money, to reduce your costs. And so I think as an industry, we're always striving to do that. I think I would agree with you. We're certainly seeing the pressure for more environmentally conscious investments from Europe. There was the WETC with that BA did that had an ESG an efficiency sort of target, an adjustment to rates based on whether or not they met that target. But the thing that we're hearing more and more on our side, and it's in North America as well, is that the investors are coming after it, and it's certainly institutional investors like pension funds really focusing down on this, and it's at a point where it's not it's a horizontal requirement to be ESG compliant, so they can't have one vehicle that is accounts for 100% of their ESG credits or requirements. It's actually a horizontal across all of their investments. So I think this is something that we're going to see going forward, and something that's going to be part of the industry going forward, and certainly something that I think will have an impact on aircraft values. Certainly for the older technology and generation aircraft that are less fuel efficient, those aircraft I think are going to be vulnerable. Certainly we saw it in kind of the 80s and the 90s when we had we went from stage 2 to stage 3, and there was a whole industry around converting those older aircraft. I don't know that we would see that dynamic today going forward with ESG considerations. I think that the requirements might be met in other ways, but it's certainly something that we see as being a focus in 2022, and like I said, it's still, I think, a very European, non-US focused focus. We are starting to see it on this side of the Atlantic. And I think at this point, we could, frankly, Olga and I could probably talk on this all day, but I don't know that everyone wants to hear us talk all day on this stuff. So I'm going to kick it over to, I guess, to Mamoon to run Q&A.
Thank you, Stuart. Yes, thank you very much to you and Olga for this very insightful and detailed conversation around values with all the different challenges that we're facing right now. Let's kick it off with two questions we have from Eric Vandenberg. So they're both very much on some of the points that you, Stuart, and Olga have touched on. The first one is, would you expect the crossover jets, so the A220, the E2s, to follow a similar path of values as the A320neo and the MAX 8 aircraft? Who wants to take that one?
I can take that.
Go ahead.
I think, interestingly enough, even though these so-called crossover aircraft are taking very much on the markets in certain places, we would like to see a bit more of proliferation before we call them successful aircraft types and akin to perform in their performance to their larger narrow bodies and the value retention. I would say at least 1,000 units would be a good fleet for an aircraft type to prevent it from becoming a niche type, which obviously niche types their values are characterized by very strong volatility as they depend on a smaller market base. I think the E2s in particular need to pick up on the orders. There's been, to be honest, the order book is quite disappointing. And as I mentioned earlier, them not able to satisfy the biggest regional jet market in the US with its scope clause is one of the biggest barriers to entry for the aircraft en masse, even though the US regional market is rather large and it will need replacement opportunities. So maybe in the future, some elements of the scope clause, like the takeoff weight, could be relaxed in order to allow these replacements to happen, especially in the view of the better fuel efficiency of these aircraft. On the value retention of the MAX variants, I would say that actually the MAX variant, we wouldn't expect to have the same value retention characteristics as we have seen with the 737NG, which probably has been the golden standard of the narrow body value retention. So maybe they will be closer to the crossover types, but not necessarily for the strength of the crossover aircraft types.
I'll just add, I think that I tend to agree with you, Olga, in terms, I don't think they're going to have the same level of value retention exactly for the reasons you said. You know, when we look at an aircraft and we think about the value, we you know, kind of the first thing that we look at is how many aircraft are in service and on firm order backlog and how many operators are there. You know, those two elements are key to liquidity and to value retention. An aircraft, and a great example is the A320ceo. You know, that aircraft had well in excess of 7,000 units delivered. I think at its peak and operator base, in excess of 250 operators. So, you know, there was a very healthy level of opportunity to place aircraft in the secondhand market. And, you know, similar experience to the 737-800. Actually, the 320-200, I believe, that's all 320 aircraft. It's 77,000, not 320-200. So, but still, you know, from a family standpoint, very, very healthy. You know, we don't have that level of deliveries and order backlog on the 220 or the 195E2. I would say that of the two aircraft, you know, I think the A220 is going to be a very good airplane. I think Airbus is, you know, is targeting the right carriers with that aircraft, and I think it is a very good aircraft, a very efficient aircraft. And so I don't think it's going to perform similarly as the Neo Max 8, just because I don't think that the market is going to be quite as large for that size of aircraft. But I still think it will be a success. I don't think it will have quite, I think the 195E2 might not be, you know, I think that aircraft is still going to be, I think, tied to, you know, a bit more to scope clause limitations within the US. So that, I think, as Olga said, you know, depending on scope clause relaxation, that may be, you know, that may drive, you know, where that airplane goes and how that aircraft retains, you know, how its value retention behaves relative to the A220-300.
Thank you for those interesting remarks. Now, just before we go to the next question from Eric, on the Max, I was intrigued by that to not have the same, as you said, Olga, the 800 is the gold standard as far as value retention. And is it because of it to not be produced same quantities as the 800, or is it because of the technical issues? And maybe subsequent question: how do you see the ESG debate impacting the values, going in like in 5-10 years? Are you expecting potential changes to the base values at any point in the future because of the ESG consequences?
Well, thank you, Mamoon, and I think it's a very good question on the Max. One of the issues with the Max has been the fact that it's been a derivative one step, probably too much, and without adjusting the airframe. So as the engine technology moved to ever larger diameter to satisfy the high bypass ratio requirements, it became more and more difficult to work with the airframe and the height of that of the ground as it existed with the 737. So, and part of the issues, unfortunately, that we have seen with the Max leading to Max grounding was related to that technical difficulty of working with the different technologies of different generations and trying to marry them together. So it's just even before the Max grounding, we have seen the dynamics of speculative orders by lessors being much easier to handle when it came to the A320neo, which is also a derivative, but obviously with much fewer iterations than it was with the Max aircraft. And even pre-grounding, we saw in the early 2019, we saw the lease rates of Max lower, significantly lower compared to those that the Neo. So the auspices weren't very great, and obviously the grounding has led to a large number of aircraft becoming whitetails, which obviously didn't help the new pricing of those aircraft. And also we're seeing more variants within that family, which obviously leads to the fragmentation of the product and reduces liquidity and remarketability, which Stuart has been talking about. So it's just the signs aren't very good for the Max. On the ESG side, I agree, Mamoon, that if there is a concerted move by the governments, similar to something that, cash for all the aircraft trade-ins, there might be an increased move towards the towards the Max and Neo, but so far we haven't seen anything of the strength that would warrant the base value revision. Not to say that may not happen in the future, but at the moment we are not seeing any concerted effort by the governments or the manufacturers apart from producing the new aircraft. So it's something to be watched for the future, and obviously a topic that we will never discard and will always try to be on top of.
I'll just add real quickly, and Olga touched on it with respect to variants. I think that if you look at the products, the Neo and the Max 8, the 320 Neo and the Max 8, I think both of those aircraft are going to be successful. But if you look at the overall family of products, 321 Neo versus Max 9, Max 10, I think that Boeing has a real challenge there. And I think if you look at the order backlog and look at the where the uptake has been, the 321 Neo has been quite successful seller versus the Max 9, Max 10, which have not been quite as successful. And that that overall family uptake and market penetration across the family does have an impact on kind of how the values are going to behave, and as I said, the opportunity going forward. So I think from a from a family standpoint, I think the MAX 8 is probably going to be a bit more challenged from a value retention standpoint than the 320neo.
Thank you both. As we're running a little bit of time, so I can ask you to keep your answers short, but although they're also is very, very valuable. Do you expect the SpaceJet to sell more ahead? Sorry, so to move ahead in the future, since it should comply with the scope clauses limits, where the E2s will certainly be too heavy to comply. 175 E2 to be precise. I guess Stuart, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm skeptical. The MRJ program, which is an offshoot of, it has been in development for a number of years, and it's coming to the market quite late. You already have a very established competitor in the 175 with Embraer. So I have, even if it will comply with scope clause limits, it would have to be delivered and provided at a very, very, very attractive price for operators and it would have to offer very compelling economics to have an operator, uptake the aircraft. I mean, I certainly, it might, there might be some success there, but I am fairly skeptical that there would be that we would see a significant uptake in that aircraft.
Okay, thanks, Stuart. Last question, I guess, is for Olga, really, and one that I'm intrigued by. Ascend have valued 6-year-old 777-300ER at below 70 million. What's your view on that?
Well, I wouldn't like to comment on specific appraisers, but I would say our view is way below that. And I think that the 777-300ER aircraft have become, in a lot of cases, one lease pony. And the best hope for the lessor is to have an extension from the original operator. And fortunately, the secondary market, even if where it exists, is at incredibly low level and gives absolutely no credit for the younger aircraft. So roll on the freight conversion program, where at least the life of the aircraft can be significantly extended with one single investment in reconfiguration.
I have to comment on this one. As you know, if as it is expected, the production rates remain low on the wide bodies from both Airbus and Boeing. Stuart alluded to this earlier. If you look at the kind of the age profile of the wide bodies, similar numbers to what will be produced will be hitting the 18-20 year kind of mark. So there's no room for growth at all. I mean, if there is any increase in demand, you will need more aircraft, simply put. So there's 777-300ER will be the only game in town for the larger side of things. I mean, right now the situation is quite difficult. But do you foresee, if you project yourself, 4 or 5 years from now, do you expect the situation to be similar, or could it be different?
I would expect that production rates of the new generation aircraft, like the 787 and the A350, will be responding to the growth in traffic quite dynamically, because that is in the best interest of the OEMs, and they obviously get only paid when they deliver the new aircraft. So it's their best interest to satisfy that growth with their new products first and foremost. Whether there'd be some uplift for the 777s, it is possible, because a high tide lifts all boats. How many aircraft will be in position to benefit from it, and how far it will go, that will be the question. Because we are seeing a lot of, like in the situation we saw with the 747, most of those 747-400s, most of those aircraft were replaced with a smaller 777. In the same way with the 777-300ER, we'll see that most of those aircraft will be replaced with the smaller 787 and A350. So that is the market dynamic when it comes to servicing more of direct routes rather than point-to-point networks, and even rather than hub and spoke networks. There will still be a niche for the larger aircraft, but I think that is going to reduce, and there might be a short time period where there is an extra demand for wide bodies, but I believe that that will not be a long-term trend.
All right. Well, listen, very, very insightful, interesting. Stuart, do you want anything to add on this one before we wrap up?
No, I'll just say, as Olga said, I don't want to comment on other appraiser values, but I would agree, I would agree that, as a very large aircraft, the 300ER is challenged in the current environment. I think a lot of the demand and action has been on the the mid-sized wide body, mid and smaller sized wide body segment. Obviously, the 787 sized A350 sized aircraft, but again, depending on how rapid we have international recovery. I said this to some colleagues earlier this month. Actually, we were looking at wide body values and and talking to some market sources, and by and large, I wonder if a year from now we're having a very different discussion on wide body values in terms of what the market to base value ratio is, and whether it's a lot closer. There's a lot smaller delta in a year from now than we see today. But certainly I would agree with Olga, the 300ER is quite a large aircraft. Clearly there's been, given the move of GCAS and some of the other organizations to start converting freighters on this aircraft, certainly they're looking for exit strategies for the airplane. But so it definitely is going to be challenged over the near term.
All right. Well, thank you very much to Olga and Stuart for, again, the very insightful comments and takes on the values. May I remind everyone that you can access the replay of this and all others ISTAT learning labs and other webinars that we have been producing, and look out for future learning lab registry, so that you can register in time on the ISTAT website. That's it for this learning lab. Thank you very much and have a great day.